Hello, my name is Lok. I'm with VMware, and today I am going to present the second part in a three-part series on the Cluster API vSphere provider. Um, on my screen right here, you will see my web browser at the repo to our provider on GitHub. Um, as mentioned in the last video, this video will focus um, on the management cluster artifact that you can build from this repo, and then on how to deploy it. Um, as I mentioned in the last project, there are some useful links on the front page of this repo, including a link to the main Cluster API project, and also a quick start for those who want to use Cluster API in a self-service model. Okay. But today we're going to talk about the management cluster. So as I mentioned in the last video, the cluster API is designed as a bunch of Kubernetes API controllers. And for that to work, you need to have an initial cluster. I mentioned in the last video that there are two problems to deploying and managing clusters, right? The first part that is important for a cluster API is how do you create that initial cluster to deploy cluster API onto? And the second part is how do you then deploy and manage cluster in an ongoing basis? Like, if, for instance, if you want to scale up the clusters, or if you want to update clusters, how would that um, occur? And I said in the last video that if it is the second problem, the day two problem, that is actually the harder problem. The day one problem is actually the easier problem. And today I'm going to show you how the vSphere provider does that using an artifact that is very common in vSphere infrastructure, which is the OVA. So let's go ahead and get started. So in this repo here, you can see that this is the folders folder path for our repo, and inside this folder path, you will see this folder named installer. This one is the one that we're going to focus on today. So let's go ahead and take a look. Here we are in the repo. This is the top level folder for the repo. So let's go ahead and go into installer. And inside of installer, we have a lot of code and a lot of files here to build an OVA. So let's go ahead and explore what it takes to build an OVA. So under the build folder, we have a build.sh script. If you type it, it will give you command line arguments. There's OVA-dev and OVA-CI. The OVA-CI is what we're going to use in our CI, and it's also going to be what we're going to use to build official artifacts. OVA-dev is what users out there who want to build this on their own should use. And the nice, I want to talk about some of the features that we built into this project, into this OVA building process. With this OVA, when you type in build-sh OVA-dev, I'm not going to run it because it takes about 5 or 6 minutes. But what this is going to do is build an OVA. It's going to build the OS VM is going to deploy all the software that you need onto it, and it will give you one file at the end. And one of the nice things that we built into this repo is that this process, this build process right here, requires no additional software for you to install. If you have Docker installed on your machine, this command will build the OVA inside of a Docker container. Okay, so I'm not going to build it today because it takes a while to build. Instead, I am going to show you once you run that command, it should build the artifact into this folder bin. And let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside of this folder. Inside of this folder, I've already built an OVA. I built it just yesterday. Here's the OVA. And this is the only file that we really need to deal with today. Well, let me take that back. There is one more piece of software that you need, that you're going to need today, and it's GoVC. This is an open source project that we have on GitHub. It's under GoV. I'll take you to the repo, GitHub.com, VMware, GoV Army. And if you go to this web page, you can get instructions on how to deploy GoVC. Now, GoVC is just a CLI that allows you to interact with vSphere. Okay, so today we're going to use that software. So let's go ahead and so with this OVA, you can also deploy it. There's three ways to deploy it. One, you can use the vSphere UI to deploy the OVA. That's probably the most common way. However, today I'm not going to use that method. The second method is to use OVF tool. You can deploy this OVA using that tool, but the third approach is to use GoVC, and that is the approach I'm going to demonstrate today. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is just check to see if our GoVC environment is set up correctly. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is, by the way, the credential that just flashed on your screen is on the test server under my desk, so it's I'm not afraid to show it. So let's go ahead, GoVC import that spec, and then we give it the OVA name. We're going to pipe it into JQ. And what I'm doing here is outputting a JSON file. And let me explain what this JSON file is. When you deploy the OVA from the vSphere console, you will then get in the process to deploy it, you will get a UI that will request some information about things like your SSH key and your the administrator password that you want on this cluster. And when we do it using GoVC, a CLI tool, we don't have that UI. So what we can do is create this JSON file and then update it and then feed it back in when we actually deploy the OVA. So now let's go ahead and modify this JSON file. So like I said up here, let's give the appliance a root password. Some generic one. Okay. The SSH key, I'm going to do a little bit later. Put VM network in there. Okay, I'm going to save it. So I didn't put in the SSH key because, well, I don't know it at the top of my head. So I'm just going to copy it right now. Pipe that into pbcopy on the Mac. pbcopy, you can just install it. GitHub will explain. If you've ever set up your SSH keys for GitHub, um, there's instructions there to install pbcopy. All that this command does is copy the content of this file into the clipboard. So now we go back and modify test.json. Okay, so now we have a functioning input JSON file, and now let's go ahead and import the OVA. So we do -- options, and then we give it the name of the JSON file, and now we're going to specify the data store that we're going to put the OVA on, and at the top of my head I know it's data store 108, and now cluster API the OVA name. So let's go ahead and execute that. So while that's running, it's going to take a little while. Let's go ahead and switch back to our web browser, and let's take a look at my little test cluster here, and you will see that it's currently deploying the OVF template right now. And I want to point out one thing. When you deploy it using GoVC or OVF tool, the name of the management cluster OVA will come up as cluster-API. When you deploy the OVA using the UI, the vSphere UI, it will have a dash and some other random characters to give you a unique OVA VM name. So while that is continuing to deploy, I want to point out a couple of other things that will become important in the part 3 of this series. You will see on here that on my vSphere UI here that I'm deploying this to a vCenter. Currently, Cluster API is tested on vCenter, and we're looking into possibly supporting standalone ESX, but that is not ready yet. So the other thing I want to point out is that you will see here that I have a resource pool named kube-resource-pool. That's going to become important in part 3 of this series. And the last thing I want to point out is we have this VM template. And this VM template is a template that I created from a Ubuntu cloud image ISO that I downloaded. And that's also going to be discussed in the next part of this series. If if this is taking too long to deploy, you can fast forward a couple of minutes, and then um, we'll continue off at that point. Okay, the OVA has deployed now. I just want to mention that that OVA took so long to deploy because I'm deploying this remotely over Wi-Fi. So um, if you're connected to a landline um, in the same vicinity as your cluster, it will be a lot faster. So now we have this cluster-API VM, and let's go ahead and start this guy up. Okay. While it's booting, let's go ahead and bring up the console for that VM. Okay, so as you see, when this boots up, we get this nice little UI indicator. And if you look down here in the blue section, it says Kubernetes cluster status. And what that is doing is it's telling us what the VM, the OVA, is doing at this point. If you recall, when I said cluster API requires the initial cluster to deploy cluster API to, well, this process, what you're seeing right here, is setting up that initial cluster. And it's going to deploy the cluster API onto that initial cluster. Once this is up and running, we can simply use cluster CTL, a CLI that we're going to talk about in the third part of this series, to deploy our clusters. And you will notice if you scan down a little bit further down this blue section, you will see information on how to uh, um, get the kubeconfig for the this OVA. And you will also see down here the IP address and the other network information for this OVA. I should probably stop calling it an OVA now because it's now a VM. Okay, so I kind of misspoke a little bit early. I said that there was information before on how to pull that kubeconfig out. Apparently, we don't get that instructions until the Kubernetes cluster is up and running. So now we have the Kubernetes management cluster up and running with the cluster API on it. So let's go ahead and download the kubeconfig for that guy. So we're back to our UI. I mean our terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and SCP root. I spelled that right. 110.118.69.108. So why I'm not able to pull that file out. So let's, oh, I just, I was going to do some debugging, but I just eyeballed what was my mistake. We got a colon in here. Okay. So now we have this cluster API dot config, kube config. And if we use kube ctl dash kube config and pass in that file, I don't remember if there's, there we go. So there we go. It shows that we have a one master cluster on this VM that the OVA deployed. And if we explore a little bit, and let's see, do get pods, all namespaces. Okay, I do not see the cluster API controllers declared already installed on it. So I guess in the third part of the series, when we use cluster CTL, we're going to deploy the cluster API to this initial cluster and then use it to create some target clusters. I think at this point that concludes the end of this video, and I hope that you come back for the third part of the series where I actually use cluster CTL, and I actually explain what cluster CTL is to deploy the cluster API onto this initial cluster, and also to create some target clusters. Okay, I will see you guys back then. Thanks.